The smell of disinfectant and barely concealed urine hit me like a punch in the gut when I first walked through the automatic doors of Sunset Manor. It was September 2019, and at 74, I never imagined I'd be shoved into a nursing home against my will, carrying only a small suitcase filled with a few clothes my own daughter had picked out for me. The metallic sound of the doors closing behind me echoed like a prison sentence, and it was at that moment that I understood the true extent of the betrayal I was suffering. My name is Eleanor Mitchell, and for 52 years I was married to Harold Mitchell, a man who built a real estate empire in our small town of Millbrook, Connecticut. Together we raised 3 children, Rebecca, now 45 and a lawyer in New York, Thomas, 42, who took over his father's business, and Sarah, the youngest, 38, who had always been the closest to me until that moment. I had dedicated my entire life to this family, giving up my career as a teacher to be the perfect wife and devoted mother they expected me to be. But on that terrible day, as a pink uniformed attendant led me through the dimly lit hallways, I knew something far more sinister was happening than simply a change of residence. Harold had died 6 months earlier, leaving me a widow and supposedly very wealthy. Our $2 million house on Elm Street, the commercial properties, the bank accounts, everything should have been mine. But Sarah, my youngest daughter, the one I trusted most, had convinced me that I was confused and incapable of making important financial decisions. The staff member, a stout woman named Nurse Patricia, led me to a tiny room that would be my new home. The walls were a depressing hospital white, with only a narrow bed, a plastic chair, and a cabinet that looked like it had been bought at a thrift store. The window overlooked the parking lot, where I could see Sarah chatting excitedly on the phone next to her new red BMW. She was gesturing enthusiastically, and even though I couldn't hear her, I recognized that look of satisfaction on her face, the same one she had had as a child after getting something she really wanted. "Your daughter said you've been experiencing some episodes of mental confusion," Nurse Patricia said in a condescending voice that made my fists clench. "But don't worry, you'll be safe and well cared for here." Safe from what? I silently wondered. Safe from having access to my own money? Safe from making my own decisions? Safe from living in the house I decorated and cared for decades? That first night at Sunset Manor, lying in the uncomfortable bed listening to the moans and whispers of the other residents in the hallways, I began to connect the dots I'd ignored for the past few months. Sarah's frequent visits to our home after Harold's death, always with stacks of paperwork she'd said were just probate formalities. The subtle comments about my advanced age and how it would be safer if I had professional help managing the finances. The doctor's appointments she'd scheduled without telling me, always insisting on accompanying me and speaking to the doctor alone first. What hurt me most was realizing that I had been completely deceived by someone I trusted blindly. Sarah had always been my confidant, the daughter who called me every day, who came to dinner with us on Sundays, who seemed genuinely interested in my opinion on everything. But now, alone in that claustrophobic room, I understood that all that closeness had a very specific purpose. She was studying me, looking for signs of weakness, moments of forgetfulness or confusion that she could use against me. During my first few weeks at Sunset Manor, I tried to stay in touch with Rebecca and Thomas, but I discovered that Sarah had been very effective in her smear campaign. When I finally reached Rebecca on the phone, she treated me with a forced patience that hurt more than open anger. "Mom, Sarah told us about the episodes you've been having," she said, in that professional voice she used in court. "It's best for you to rest and let her handle everything for now." Thomas was even worse. When I tried to explain that there was nothing wrong with me, that Sarah was lying, he simply sighed heavily and said, "Mom, that's exactly what someone with dementia would say." The word dementia hit me like a bolt of lightning. Was this what Sarah was spreading about me? Was this how she had gained the support of my other children and presumably the doctors who had signed the necessary papers to commit me. But if there was one thing my 74 years of life had taught me, it was that patience and observation are powerful weapons. So instead of continuing to protest my sanity, I began doing what I'd always done best, planning. During the day, I pretended to be the confused old lady everyone expected me to be. But at night, in the silence of my room, I worked out every detail of my revenge. The first step was getting access to a computer. This wasn't easy at Sunset Manor, but I discovered that the small-town library was just 3 blocks away, and residents who demonstrated good behavior could go for supervised walks. It took me 2 weeks to convince Nurse Patricia that I was adjusting well, and that some exercise and reading would do me good. At the library, I discovered that my situation was more serious than I'd imagined. Sarah hadn't just placed me in a nursing home. She'd obtained the legal guardianship over me. She controlled my finances, my medical decisions, even my correspondence. It was as if I died civilly, even though I was perfectly lucid and healthy. But I also discovered something Sarah didn't know. Harold had created safeguards in his will, clauses that only a very experienced lawyer would spot. The lawyer who drafted Harold's will, James Whitmore, had been a family friend for over 30 years. He knew Harold better than anyone, knew how my husband thought, and most importantly, knew that Harold would never allow his children to take away my independence. There were specific provisions regarding my mental health, but there were also provisions for cases of undue influence or financial manipulation by the heirs. The most shocking discovery came when I accessed the online bank accounts using information Harold had given me years earlier for emergencies. Sarah had transferred over $800,000 from the joint accounts to her personal account just a week after I checked into Sunset Manor. She had sold 2 of Harold's commercial properties at well below market value to buyers who, upon further investigation, I discovered were companies linked to her husband Marcus. It was at that moment that I realized this wasn't just a greedy daughter trying to accelerate her inheritance. It was an elaborate scheme, likely planned for months, perhaps even before Harold's death. Sarah and Marcus had seen my husband's death as a golden opportunity, and I was merely an obstacle to be removed as legally as possible. But they had gravely underestimated Eleanor Mitchell. I hadn't survived 52 years of marriage, raised 3 children, and helped Harold build a business empire as a weak or naive woman. They wanted to play a dirty game? Very well. But in this game, I knew all the rules, held all the cards, and was prepared to show them what a truly determined woman was capable of. My first real insight into the extent of Sarah's betrayal came 3 weeks later when I finally managed to get a private call to James Whitmore. It had taken days to convince one of the younger employees, Michelle, to let me use the office phone during her lunch break. Pretending to have a moment of clarity where I remembered important matters was easier than I'd imagined. These people were so used to truly confused elderly people that any sign of lucidity was interpreted as a temporary window of consciousness. Eleanor? My God, where are you? Sarah told me you were in terrible shape, that you couldn't even recognize people. James's familiar voice echoed through the phone, filled with genuine concern. For a moment, I nearly burst into tears, hearing from someone who truly knew me, who had been there for me through my best and worst moments alongside Harold. But there was no time for sentimentality. I only had 15 minutes before Michelle returned from lunch. James, listen to me carefully. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm lucid, alert, and completely capable of making my own decisions. Sarah lied to everyone, including you. My voice came out firmer than I expected, laden with all the authority I'd developed over decades as the wife of a wealthy businessman. She put me here against my will and is stealing my inheritance. I need you to come see me today. The silence on the other end of the line lasted an eternity. I could almost hear James's thoughts racing, trying to process information that completely contradicted everything Sarah had told him. Finally, he sighed deeply and said, "Eleanor, if this is true, then we're dealing with something very serious." Sarah presented medical documents, detailed psychiatric reports. She said you had episodes where you didn't recognize yourself, that you left the stove on, that you got lost in your own house. "All lies," I replied through gritted teeth. "And I'm sure if you investigate these medical reports, you'll find they were obtained through false information or doctors who barely examined me. James, you've known me for 30 years. Have you ever seen me act confused or irrational?" The question hung in the air for a few seconds before I continued. "Harold left safeguards in his will for situations just like this, didn't he?" The change in James's tone was immediate. His seasoned lawyer's voice took over, and I could sense he was mentally reviewing every clause of Harold's will. "Yes, there are specific provisions regarding coercion and undue influence. Eleanor, if you're right about this, Sarah may be committing not only fraud, but also elder abuse. I'll be there in 2 hours." After hanging up the phone, I felt a spark of genuine hope for the first time in weeks, but it was short-lived. When I returned to my room, I found Sarah waiting for me, sitting in the plastic chair with an expression I'd never seen on her face before. It was cold, calculating, almost predatory. In that moment, I realized that the sweet, loving daughter I'd raised might never have truly existed. "Hi, Mom," she said in a sugary voice that didn't match her icy eyes at all. "The nurse told me you were having a good day today, that you even managed to remember some details about Dad." She tilted her head slightly, studying my reaction. "That's wonderful. But I also worry that you might be confusing yourself again, trying to call people who might not understand your current condition. It was obvious someone had told her about my call to James, likely Michelle herself, who, I now realized, must have been receiving extra money to report my activities." The level of manipulation and control Sarah had established was both impressive and terrifying. She had corrupted officials, forged medical documents, and orchestrated an entire narrative about my supposed dementia with the precision of a general planning a war. "So I've decided it might be best for you to have a little less freedom for now," Sarah continued, pulling some papers out of her Louis Vuitton bag, a bag I recognized as having been purchased with money from the bank accounts she'd emptied. "I talked to Dr. Peterson about increasing your medication, just something gentle to help you stay calmer, more focused on the present." Dr. Peterson was the psychiatrist who had signed the documents declaring me mentally incompetent, a man I had met exactly twice, always in Sarah's presence, and who had based his diagnosis primarily on what my daughter had reported about my behavior. Now Sarah was proposing to forcibly medicate me, likely with drugs that would actually leave me confused and incapacitated, creating the reality she had invented about my mental state. "I'm not taking any medication," I declared firmly, looking her straight in the eye. "And you know damn well there's nothing wrong with me, Sarah. The only thing sick here is what you're doing to me and your father's memory." For a moment, I saw a crack in the perfect mask she'd constructed, a flash of genuine anger that revealed the real person behind the devoted daughter she pretended to be. "Mommy, you're getting agitated again," she said, her voice taking on the condescending tone I'd learned to hate. "This is exactly the kind of paranoid behavior Dr. Peterson mentioned. You're creating conspiracy theories about your own family." Sarah stood and walked to the window, scanning the parking lot where her BMW was parked next to a black Mercedes I didn't recognize. "Marcus is waiting downstairs. We brought some papers for you to sign." Sarah's husband, Marcus, was a man I'd never fully liked, even before I discovered his role in this scheme. He was the kind of person who always seemed to be calculating the monetary value of everything around him, including people. At 40, he'd spent most of his adult career in mediocre jobs, always looking for get-rich-quick schemes that never panned, out. Until now, apparently. What kind of papers? I asked, even though I already knew it wouldn't be anything that would benefit me. Sarah smiled, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and that reminded me unpleasantly of the expressions I used to see on Harold's face when he was about to close a particularly lucrative deal. The difference was, Harold had never used that expression with me. He reserved his business acumen for competitors and business partners, not his own family. Just a few property transfers that need to be finalized. The house on Elm Street is too expensive for your current budget, and you really don't need such a large house. We thought it would be better to sell it and invest the money in something safer. She paused, probably expecting me to protest or get emotional. But years of marriage to Harold had taught me to maintain a neutral face during important negotiations, even when my heart was breaking. The house on Elm Street wasn't just a property. It was the place where I'd raised my children, where Harold and I had shared more than 5 decades of memories, where every room told the story of our life together. The rose garden I'd planted and tended for 30 years, the kitchen where I'd prepared thousands of meals for my family, Harold's office, where he'd built his empire. Sarah wanted to take it all away from me, and she still expected me to sign the papers with gratitude. "I'm not signing anything," I replied calmly, crossing my arms over my chest. "And if you try to force me, I'll scream until the entire staff in this place comes running here." It was an empty threat. I knew the Sunset Manor staff were more likely to take Sarah's word than mine, but I wanted to see how she would react to direct resistance. The mask slipped again, this time for longer. For a few seconds, I saw Sarah's true face, cruel, greedy, and completely devoid of the love I had naively believed she felt for me. "Mom, you're going to sign these papers one way or another. I can do this the easy way, by explaining everything, simply to you, or I can do it the hard way, by having Dr. Peterson declare that you're having a psychotic episode and require sedation for your own safety." It was a clear and direct threat. Sarah was telling me, bluntly, that she had enough power to forcibly drug me if I didn't cooperate. The reality of my situation hit me like a bucket of ice water. I was completely at the mercy of someone who not only didn't love me, but who apparently saw me as nothing more than an obstacle between her and my inheritance. For a moment, I felt despair nearly engulf me. But then I remembered Harold's words during one of our last conversations before his death. "Eleanor, you are stronger than you think. If anything happens to me, don't let anyone underestimate you. You built this empire by my side, and you know every secret, every contract, every person who can help or harm you." At the time, I thought he was just being sentimental. Now I realize that perhaps he had foreseen this very situation. "Okay, Sarah," I finally said, my voice sounding defeated and tired. "Where do I need to sign?" I saw the instant relief in her eyes, the satisfaction of someone who believes they've easily won a difficult battle. She had no idea I was just beginning the war, and that I had learned from the best strategist she knew, her own father. Marcus came up to my room 20 minutes later, carrying a black leather briefcase and wearing a suit I recognized as a designer brand far too expensive for his legitimate income. He avoided direct eye contact with me, which confirmed my suspicions, that he knew exactly how sordid the scheme he was running was. Unlike Sarah, who seemed genuinely to believe her own narrative about taking care of me, Marcus was knowingly criminal in his actions. "Hello, Eleanor," he said with a forced cordiality that couldn't mask the discomfort in his voice. "Sarah tells me you're having some better days. That's wonderful." He opened the folder on the small table next to my bed, revealing a stack of documents that looked like they'd been prepared by a professional law firm. Each page had yellow markers indicating where I should sign, and everything looked legitimately legal to someone who couldn't read between the lines. As Marcus organized the papers, I took the opportunity to study every detail of his appearance and demeanor. His hands trembled slightly, a sign of nervousness he tried to hide by constantly adjusting his tie. There was a sweat stain on the left armpit of his shirt, despite the room's air conditioning working perfectly. Even more revealing was the way he constantly checked his wristwatch, as if in a hurry to finish this and get out of there as quickly as possible. "These documents are quite simple, actually," he began, his voice assuming the professional tone he'd probably used in his previous jobs in insurance and investments. "This first section authorizes the sale of the property on Elm Street. Sarah has found an excellent buyer who is offering a very fair price." He pointed to a number that, even upside down, I could see was at least $400,000 below the property's true value. "And who is this generous buyer?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral and slightly confused, as if it were a question of innocent curiosity from an elderly woman who didn't fully understand what was going on. Marcus exchanged a quick glance with Sarah, and it was at that moment that I confirmed my suspicions about the buyer's true identity. "It's a very reputable investment firm," Sarah replied quickly before Marcus could speak. "They specialize in historic properties and promise to keep the house in excellent condition." The lie fell so naturally from her lips that for a moment I almost believed her. But I'd spent decades listening to Harold negotiate, and I knew the sound of a well-rehearsed lie when I heard one. The second set of documents was even more audacious. Marcus explained with the enthusiasm of someone trying to sell a used car, with engine trouble, that this was a reorganization of my investment accounts. All stocks, bonds, and certificates of deposit would be transferred to a trust account managed by Sarah for protection against market fluctuations and impulsive financial decisions. Dr. Peterson specifically recommended this action, Sarah added, producing an official letter on letterhead that looked perfectly legitimate. He said that people in your condition can make erratic financial decisions that can result in significant losses. The letter was signed in the illegible handwriting typical of doctors, and anyone not intimately familiar with the situation would have completely sworn in its authenticity. But there was a problem with Dr. Peterson's letter that Sarah didn't notice: the date. It was dated a week before my first appointment with him. This meant the diagnosis had been written before the doctor even met me, confirming that the entire process had been fabricated from the start. It was concrete evidence of fraud that I could use later, so I pretended not to notice the error and continued listening to the explanations. The third document was the cruelest of all. It was a complete and irrevocable power of attorney that would give Sarah complete control over all my medical, financial, and legal decisions. In essence, it would be as if I had legally died, retaining only the right to breathe. Sarah would have the power to decide where I would live, what medical treatments I would receive, even whether I could receive visits from others. "That seems very broad," I commented, allowing a hint of uncertainty to creep into my voice. "Maybe I should talk to a lawyer before signing something so important." It was a perfectly reasonable question that any sensible person would ask, but I could see immediately that I had touched a nerve. Marcus and Sarah exchanged another look, this one more tense than the last. Sarah leaned forward in her chair, adopting the posture I recognized from when she was a child, and about to tell an elaborate lie to get out of trouble. "Mommy, you know James Whitmore has a conflict of interest, having been Dad's lawyer for so many years. It would be better to have a fresh, independent perspective." The irony of Sarah talking about conflicts of interest while trying to rob me wasn't lost on me, but I kept my expression neutral. "Maybe you're right," I murmured, picking up the pen Marcus had placed on the table. "Where exactly do I need to sign?" It was then that I heard the sound I'd been waiting for. Firm, determined footsteps in the hallway, accompanied by the authoritative voice of James Whitmore arguing with someone from the Sunset Manor staff. Sarah and Marcus didn't recognize the voice, but I knew exactly who it was. My heart began to pound, but I forced myself to maintain the same slightly confused expression I'd been wearing throughout the conversation. "I insist on seeing my client immediately," I heard James say in the hallway, his voice carrying all the authority of 40 years of legal practice. "I'm the attorney handling Harold Mitchell's estate, and I have urgent matters to discuss with his widow." The clerk's response was too muffled for me to understand, but the defensive tone was unmistakable. Sarah frowned, obviously recognizing the name even without recognizing the voice. "This must be some misunderstanding," she said, more to herself than to us. "James knows all probate matters must go through me first." She stood and walked to the door, probably planning to intercept the lawyer before he reached my room. But James Whitmore wasn't easily discouraged. Less than 2 minutes later, he appeared at my bedroom door, and the look on his face when he saw Marcus and Sarah with the documents spread out on my desk was one of pure shock and outrage. For a moment, no one said anything. James took in the scene, the transfer papers, the pen in my hand, the guilty expressions on Sarah and Marcus's faces, and I could see his legal brain processing exactly what he was witnessing. "What the hell is going on here?" James asked, his voice low, but filled with a controlled fury I'd rarely heard him use. His eyes flicked from the documents to Sarah, then to Marcus, and finally landed on me. "Eleanor, are you okay? Is someone forcing you to sign something?" Sarah tried to regain control of the situation, adopting the condescending tone she'd perfected over the past few weeks. "James, what a surprise to see you here. As I explained on the phone, Mom has been having episodes of confusion, and Dr. Peterson recommended that all major financial decisions be supervised to protect her from—" She paused, searching for the right words, decisions she might regret later. James cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. "Sarah, stop talking, now!" His voice had taken on the icy tone he used in court when he was about to destroy an opponent's argument. "Eleanor, just answer yes or no. Are you here of your own free will?" The question echoed through the room like a gunshot, and everyone present understood that the answer would change everything. I looked Sarah straight in the eye, watching panic begin to set in as she realized her carefully planned scheme was crumbling before her eyes. For months she had controlled every aspect of the narrative about my mental health and competence. She had isolated me from anyone who might question her version of events, corrupted medical and nursing home staff, and constructed a web of lies so elaborate it seemed impenetrable. But Sarah had made a crucial mistake. She underestimated the strength of a woman who had spent 5 decades alongside one of Connecticut's most astute businessmen. Harold may be gone, but he had taught me everything he knew about strategy, patience, and perfect timing. And the time for my revenge had finally arrived. The silence that followed my statement was deafening. I could hear the hum of the air conditioning, the ticking of the clock on the wall, even the rapid beating of my own heart. Sarah stood completely still for a few seconds, her mind clearly racing to find a way out of the situation that had become a death trap for her plans. Marcus, on the other hand, looked ready to vomit, his face taking on a greenish hue that confirmed he knew exactly what the legal implications of what they had done were. James moved with the precision of a seasoned predator. He walked to the table where the documents were spread out and began to quickly scan them, his expression growing darker with each page he turned. "Irrevocable power of attorney, transfer of property at below market value, full medical guardianship," he muttered to himself, listing each crime in his head. "Sarah, do you have any idea what federal charges could be filed against you?" "James, you don't understand." Sarah finally found her voice, but it was no longer confident. Mom was really confused. There were weeks where she didn't recognize me. Dr. Peterson documented everything. I have reports, witnesses. Her voice grew higher and more desperate with each word, revealing the panic she felt as her carefully constructed narrative was being dismantled Witnesses you paid, James interrupted dryly. Like Michelle, the employee you bribed to report Eleanor's activities. He turned to me with an expression that mixed admiration and concern. Eleanor told me about this during our phone conversation. She also told me about the unauthorized bank transfers you made last week. It was Marcus's turn to finally panic. His legs seemed to give out, and he slumped heavily into the plastic chair Sarah had previously occupied. Sarah, you told me your mother authorized these transfers, he murmured, his voice barely audible. You said she was just having trouble remembering things, not that... He trailed off, realizing his words were only confirming his involvement in the scheme. Wasn't that you were being kidnapped and held against your will? James finished with a predatory smile. Wasn't that you were being drugged to make yourself look confused? Wasn't that you were being isolated from anyone who might question what you were doing? He pulled his cell phone from his pocket and began dialing. I'll call Sheriff Thompson right now. Eleanor, would you like to press charges? The transformation in Sarah in that moment was absolute and terrifying. The mask of the caring, concerned daughter completely disappeared, revealing someone I didn't recognize as my own. Her eyes narrowed with cold fury, and when she spoke, her voice was laced with venom that made me instinctively recoil. You think you're so clever, don't you, Mom? You think you can make a fool of me? Sarah, James said warningly, recognizing the signs of someone about to do something very stupid. But she ignored him completely, focused solely on me with an intensity that bordered on harassment. For a moment, I genuinely feared for my physical safety. The person standing in front of me was no longer my daughter. She was a dangerous stranger who had lost everything and had nothing left to lose. You want to know the truth? Sarah continued, her voice almost hysterical. I hoped you would die, with Dad. You two always thought yourselves so superior to the rest of us, with your big house and your important friends. Dad always treated you like a queen, and you loved to look down on us, your common, unimportant children. Tears of anger streamed down her face, but there was nothing sad about them. They were pure, distilled fury. The words hit me like a physical blow. In 50 years of life, I had never considered myself superior to my children. Harold and I had worked hard to give them every opportunity we hadn't had growing up. We paid for expensive private schools, prestigious colleges, helped with down payments on houses, and loans for failed businesses. I always thought we were being generous and dedicated parents. Sarah, stop, Marcus whispered, probably realizing that every word out of his wife's mouth was digging a deeper legal hole for both of them. But she was past the point of listening to sensible advice. Decades of pent-up resentment were gushing out like water from a burst dam. Rebecca was always the favorite because she was a lawyer like you wanted to be, James, she continued, pointing an accusing finger at the lawyer. Thomas was the heir to Dad's empire, and me, I was just the middle child who was never good enough for anything. But guess what? I'm the only one who was smart enough to see an opportunity and seize it. James finished dialing and put the phone to his ear. Sheriff Thompson? James Whitmore here. I need to report a case of kidnapping, Elder. Fraud and larceny at Sunset Manor. Yes, it's an emergency. He paused, listening for the answer, then continued. The victim is Eleanor Mitchell, widow of Harold Mitchell. Her daughter Sarah and son-in-law are here now, trying to force her to sign transfer documents. The mention of the police was like throwing a bucket of cold water over Sarah. The reality of her situation finally penetrated the fog of anger and resentment. She looked at Marcus, who had gone completely pale and was clearly in shock, then at James speaking to the authorities, and finally at me. For a moment I saw a glimpse of the child she had been, scared, confused, and desperately in need of approval. Mommy, she said, her voice returning to the pleading tone I knew well. Please don't let him do this. We're family. We can work and this out between us, without involving the police. She approached my bed, reaching out her hands as she had done thousands of times as a child, wanting something I'd initially denied her. "I didn't want to hurt you. I needed the money. Marcus lost his job last year and we have so much debt." It was pathetic to see someone who had been so calculating and cruel just minutes before now trying to appeal to the maternal instincts she had systematically trampled on for months. But the damage was done. She hadn't just tried to steal my money. She had tried to steal my identity, my dignity, my very sanity. She had turned me into a prisoner in my own life. "You chose to treat your own mother as an enemy, Sarah," I replied, keeping my voice steady despite my heartbreak. "You falsified medical documents, isolated me from my friends, corrupted officials, threatened me with forced sedation. This wasn't a desperate mistake. It was a calculated, systematic attack on someone who loved you unconditionally." James ended his call and turned to us. "The police will be here in 15 minutes. Eleanor, I'm calling Judge Harrison now to get an emergency order canceling the guardianship. Based on what I've seen here today, I'm sure he'll agree it was obtained through fraudulent means." He paused, looking directly at Sarah. "I strongly recommend you get a criminal lawyer, Sarah, and a good one." The sound of distant sirens began to echo through the open window. It was a sound I'd heard thousands of times over the years, but it had never been directed at my own family. Sarah heard it too, and what little color remained in her face drained completely. Marcus was visibly shaking now, his hands twitching nervously as he glanced toward the door, as if calculating his chances of escape. "You're not going anywhere," James said calmly, as if he could read Marcus's thoughts. "Attempting to escape would only worsen your legal situation." He moved to stand between them and the door, not threateningly, but making it clear that he wouldn't allow them to leave before the police arrived. During those final minutes before the authorities arrived, I studied Sarah's face, trying to find some trace of the daughter I had raised and loved for nearly 40 years. But all I could see was a stranger who had used my love against me in the cruelest way possible. She had carefully planned to rob me not only financially, but also psychologically, trying to convince me that I was losing my sanity. The thud of heavy boots in the hallway announced the arrival of the sheriff's team. Nurse Patricia appeared in the doorway first, her confused expression turning to shock as she took in the scene in the room: uniformed officers, a family clearly in crisis, and legal documents scattered everywhere. "What's going on here?" she asked, but her voice lacked the condescending authority she normally used with me. "We're arresting 2 people for elder fraud, kidnapping, and larceny," replied Sheriff Thompson, a man I knew from the town social functions where Harold and I regularly attended. His eyes widened when he recognized me sitting on the bed, clearly, lucid and articulate, the complete opposite of the confused, incapacitated woman Sarah had described to the entire town. "Eleanor Mitchell," he said, approaching my bed with an expression of genuine disbelief. "My wife told me that you had—" He trailed off, clearly unsure how to finish the sentence without causing offense. It was obvious Sarah had spread her lie throughout the community, likely to ensure no one would question my sudden absence or the sudden transfer of property. "I was hospitalized against my will based on false medical documents," I finished for him. "My daughter orchestrated this entire scheme to gain control of my inheritance while I was still alive to see it." The words came out with more bitterness than I intended, but they perfectly reflected the betrayal I felt.